and you are here for our webinar on XBRL APIs and the XBRL data community. With us today are Mark Ward. Mark is Applications Manager at XBRL US, David Torriello, VP of Operations, and Michelle Savage, myself, VP Communication, all at XBRL US. Today we're going to be talking about a set of APIs, some tools that we've made available to the general public. And what we're going to be covering today, we're going to first talk about what kind of XBRL data is available around the world, how we can help you get it. We're going to talk about what tools are available and where you can find them. We're going to provide some examples of different types of tools and spreadsheets that we've made available to you. And then we're going to talk about how you can learn to do this yourself. And then finally cover how much data is available for you to access. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the type of data that is available today. When you think about XBRL, it's really a global standard. It's maintained by XBRL International, which is a global standards organization. And it's used today in over 60 countries around the world by over 10 million companies. And it's been adopted by over 100 regulators on a global basis. So it's really very widespread. And so there's a wealth of data out there that's available for frankly, for anyone to use. If you look at the two boxes on the screen here, the blue box shows the data that's available for US public companies. The SEC has required the use of XBRL for US operating companies reporting in US GAAP, and also companies that are reporting in IFRS, foreign private issuers. So we have data going back to 2009 for US public companies and 2017 for foreign private issuers. Mutual funds and credit rating agencies also began reporting in XBRL format starting in 2009. So the SEC requires a fair amount of information to be reported. The FFIEC actually began their implementation in 2005, requiring over 8,000 banks to report in XBRL format. So there's a lot of data there as well. And the Department of Energy it doesn't require, but it funded a program to develop a taxonomy for solar financing under the Department of Energy Sunshot Initiative. And that taxonomy, which is fairly large, is now available for use, and we're working on expanding the different types of use cases for which that can be used. So there's a lot of what we call orange button data that is rapidly becoming available as well. Outside the US, there are a lot of implementations throughout the world. Public companies are required to report in South Korea, in Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Israel, China, Japan, Taiwan, and Canada. And private companies also have to report in XBRL in the UK, Spain, Denmark, South Korea, Italy, Belgium, and Germany. Banks are also required to report in Peru, Panama, and Chile. And government agencies in the Netherlands and Australia are also required to report in XBRL. And that's actually business to government implementation. So this gives you a sense of the breadth of information that's out there. And with some of the tools that we put together at XBRL US, we really wanted to make sure that we brought that data to you, to the general public. So let's talk a little bit about how we can help you get XBRL data, get access to some of this data. Back when the SEC program first went into place in 2009, we started looking at the data that was coming in and decided to create a database. So the XBRL US database began extracting an RSS feed from the SEC and pulling in all of the US GAAP data that was reported by public companies. So we pulled in all the US GAAP data, and then starting in 2017, when foreign private issuers began filing, we began pulling in IFRS data as well. So we created this database really to test out some analytical tools that we were developing. We also wanted to check the quality of XBRL data, and we wanted to provide a means to demonstrate how XBRL data can be used. So this database has been incredibly valuable for us. Many of our members use it today, and we plan to add to that database over time. And the next country-specific data that we plan on including will be coming from Japan, from Mexico, and Taiwan. And then, from there, we'll just keep adding to it because we see this as a very helpful tool that we can provide. And it's also, frankly, relatively easy to do simply because of the capabilities of XBRL. In concert with the database, we have started developing APIs, application programming interfaces, which are tools that allow us to basically serve up this data in an easy form. We developed the first set of APIs several years ago, and then in 2018, just this year, we introduced a second release of the XBRL API standard. We designed this as a standard that can be used with any kind of XBRL formatted data. So any of the data that we talked about earlier from Japan, from Mexico, from Taiwan, ultimately from the UK, from bank data, all of that data can be extracted using the XBRL API standard. And this is a free and open tool that we're making available to everyone. And frankly, some of the data in our database we're also making freely available to the general public. So the XBRL API was designed first and foremost to improve the ease of use in working with XBRL formatted data. As I said, it can be used with any taxonomy that conforms to the global specification. So the API can pull out not only data, fact values that are reported in instance documents, but it can also pull information out of individual taxonomies. We also created the API to encourage the development of applications because the API can be incorporated into any commercial or open source application out there to provide any kind of analysis that you may want to conduct. To support the API, we've developed something that we call the data community. And this is really a forum designed for developers to get their questions answered about how they can use the API. So we really want to use the data community to encourage the creation of more open source tools for users. We want to encourage the embedding of XBRL APIs into open source or commercial applications. And we also want to use our forum to get feedback about the APIs. What needs to be changed? How can we make them easier to use? And that's really why we're holding webinars like this, to get more people engaged. So let's talk a little bit about some of the tools that are available today that you can use immediately. And I'm going to turn over now to Mark Ward. Mark?
Thanks, Michelle. Yes, we have several tools that will allow you to query the database. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see there's the company filing analysis, which is a component of our XBRL US tools. This allows you to be able to view the most recent SEC filings that were submitted to the SEC, as well as examining concepts and values that are related to those filings. There's also tools to allow you to do advanced queries that will help you look for any kind of information that that pertains to these filings. The other two tools that you see here are basically tied directly to the XBRL US API that Michelle talked about just a few moments ago. The first is Insomnia, is the Insomnia client on the left-hand side, which allows sort of a raw view of the information. This is accessed the same way that developers will access with programmatic access to the API. In the bottom right, you can see our XBRL spreadsheet, which uses an add-on developed for Google Sheets. And the advantage of this is that it allows you to access the API without dealing with authentication that developers would have to. So documentation for all of these is on our website, which David will actually discuss right now. David?
Thanks, Mark. If you've been to the XBRL US website, and I'm assuming anybody who's on this call has been to the website, there's a button in the top row on the homepage called Data. If you hover your mouse over that Data button, a menu will drop down and there'll be a couple of options that are relevant to today's discussion, there are actually several options. The first two are XBRL the XBRL API and XBRL Data Community, which is the focus here today. The third option, just to make note of it before we move along, is the public database of filings. That's really the basis for the API, or our implementation of the API. It draws from that data set that is the XBRL database of public filings. So moving ahead, thanks for moving it along. On the inside of the API, Michelle, if you could go back, that'd be great. Thank you. On the left-hand side of the screen, what you're looking at is a screenshot of the API page. A couple of things to note on the page itself. If you're not logged in, you will see a mock-up of a PHP to HTML implementation of a draw or a call from the database of public filings. This happens to be the two most recent inline filings that have been made, the two most recent 10K inline filings, I should say. If you look closely, the dates on the screen on the left-hand side are sometime in late August to mid-September. And if you were to go and log in on that page, the page refreshes. And I know from having done this in the last week or so, those two 10Ks are now outdated. They're no longer the most recent 10Ks that have been filed in inline format. If you were to scroll down on that page, we give you a little snippet of what the underlying code looks like for those of you that are developing in PHP. Somebody asked on a recent webinar that we did for members about the authentication, the OAuth 2 that we're using. We're actually using the standard Google OAuth, and there's a GitHub repository where you can start noodling around with some of the code that's in there. But for those of you that have maybe grabbed a client ID and secret, that's a good place to mash those up with your OAuth implementation. On the right hand, not to keep going on about that, on the right hand side, the data community, that's where we're maintaining a series or a set of templates and other artifacts that our members are contributing. We do periodic member webinars where we talk about best practice in the use of the API. We share templates that have been developed by members. We share our own templates and talk a little bit about how to perhaps get specific data out of the database and into a Google Sheet, or potentially, hopefully at some point down the road, we get members who start sharing their web applications or their desktop applications to the community, and members get first crack at testing them out and providing feedback. That's kind of a long-term, I think, vision for where we see that contributed tools and resources section of the community going. Last but not least, for those who are starting out and have questions about how to look at the API and how to perhaps put together a proof of concept for specific calls using the Google Sheet before you start coding it into your applications, and you run into questions about what specific parameters of the API mean, we invite you to load up those questions in that online discussion forum. For a number of years, we've been doing one-off requests and responses. This is a way to kind of extend understanding to a much broader community that's becoming more interested in standardized data. Michelle, you want to move to the next slide? Drilling down a little bit more into the right side navigation of that API page, we have a set of resources that are available in easy reach on either of these pages, the API page or the community page. Those resources include the discussion forum that I just noted, the documentation, which is really critical to complete understanding and a high degree of success with the API. It's built in a plain language structure, so it's pretty easy to understand, especially for those who are not familiar with the syntax and the language around XBRL. It distills it into something that's pretty meaningful just by looking at the string, and set up in a very easy to approach API. Nevertheless, the documentation really supports a full, a deep, and a complete understanding of all of the possibilities and all of the potentials. One of the other things in the documentation is that we're continuing to extend the API. We're continuing to add features and functionality. As you open up the documentation and start going through it, you may find sections that are grayed out, or parameters that are grayed out. Those are things that we're intending to expose once we feel like it's been developed to a point where it matches what we were designing it for. Let's see, in addition, on the under the API resources, the Google Sheet add-on, something we'll take a look at in just a couple of seconds here, and the XBRL spreadsheet, really the first of the templates that have been made available. I think today we have 3. We've heard from a couple of other folks who are developing not only Google Sheet templates, but hopefully at some point we get somebody who will contribute an Excel spreadsheet, since I think a significant number of financial data parties are probably still using Excel-based spreadsheets for their models and for their analyses. Don't have one yet. It's really beyond resource scope for us as a group, but if you develop one and you want to contribute it, we'd be happy to take a look and put it up on our site. Michelle, you want to move it ahead? Great. So how does the XBRL API spreadsheet work? We're going to take a few minutes here to do some demonstrations. We've got 3 things lined up here. Mark is actually going to lead us off with the API spreadsheet. I'll come back and talk a little bit about the initial balance sheet that was posted. And then Michelle's going to do a brief R&D expenditure example. Mark?
Thanks, David. Give me one moment here. I am going to...
And I also want to mention, this is Michelle again, that if you have questions as we go through this, please submit your questions through the Q&A link that you see on the screen, and then we'll just take them as they come in.
Okay. Thanks, Michelle. All right. Let's see. Right now, you should be able to see the XBRL API spreadsheet right now. If you go to the website that David just showed you and click on this sheet, you'll see it will. This is a sheet that we set up that uses the add-on, and it will help you get started with any work that you will be doing. The first thing that you'd want to do is make sure you make a copy of the spreadsheet. The way that Google works, it doesn't work correctly if you don't make a copy. So on this first sheet, this is the main sheet right here, and as you can see, I have some information that's actually pulled by the API. Basically, what you would do is craft what kind of information, craft a query based on what kind of information that you wish for. In this case, I'm asking for it to return the last 10 facts. There's also a few other examples that we've set up. For example, like if you wanted to see the last 20 filings that were submitted by the SEC, we can switch to here, and it basically shows each of the filings. This is the basic table information for the filing. Another example would be specific fact information. So this is again, the last 20 or so, actually not the last 20 or so, but 20 or so fact information that's been returned. And if you go down through some of these options, so this right here allows you to show the query results. You can also show what fields are going to be returned by selecting the field tree. So you can see everything down here. We do have dimensional information as well. That's basically flattened in the display that I showed a moment ago. You can actually drill down into this information and show individual information by choosing specific information, specific field. So we can get report IDs, or for things that are multidimensional, like the dimensions there, you can just type in that and it will return a table with the information back. This next tab is basically the configuration tab, and this is where you would actually build the queries that you wish to come back. Each of these queries are basically dependent on objects, and also have various parameters that you can submit, and you can also narrow down the number of fields that are displayed in each one. We'll show you a little more about this in the next sheet, which basically shows some of the information, some of the point information. Oops. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and pass this to you, David, and let me release this here.
And while we're switching screens, we did receive a couple of questions. And the first question is, do you provide any data cleansing on the XBRL data, like improper negative values? We actually do not. We see our database really as a demonstration database. It's not a design for commercial use. And so we actually use the database because we look for things like, errors that may be in the data that's being produced, because we then take those errors and we translate them into validation rules that we generate and make available to SEC filers. So we do things like calendarizing. We do normalize the data to some extent, just from a calendar standpoint, so that it can be served up. But we don't do any particular data cleaning. We leave that job to the commercial data providers, like the calc benches and the Refinitives and organizations like that. A second question that we got is, what would be the process for suggesting technical enhancements to the API? Would that be the developer forum? And that's actually a really good question. Technical enhancements, we would love to see those in the data community, data forum, developer forum, whatever you want to call it. But if you post those there, we will be reading those, and then frankly, others may others in the community may weigh in on that as well, and provide a kind of get a dialogue going. So please do. We're getting a couple of other questions. Let's see. How can I make my own data model? And the API is freely available. And as Mark was showing earlier, there are several different ways of using it. The way that most developers would use it would probably be through some kind of a client like Insomnia, and so that's you're able to use it that way. You could also use one of these templates, these spreadsheet templates that we've created. These are really designed to demonstrate the capabilities, but any of those are available. And for the templates, the spreadsheet templates, if you create your own data model and provide that to us, we're actually looking to, we have sort of special prizes for special membership opportunities for those who provide us with their own data models using one of these templates. And let's see, a couple of other questions we've received. David, do you want to go ahead and get started on this, or should we go through the rest of the questions?
No, let's take the questions, Michelle.
Okay. Okay, the next question is the API querying Edgar directly, or do you have a local copy of the data? Very good question. The API is actually querying the XBRL US database, which pulls data from RSS feed from the SEC. So we get the data directly from the SEC, we dump it into our database, and then it's available typically about 15 minutes after it's posted to Edgar. So it's very quick. And the API works on our database, but frankly, it can work on any database. The SEC content is not really data-based, it's all in individual files, so it has to be data-based before it can be kind of easily used. And Mark or David, do you have anything else that you wanted to say on that question?
No, that was great.
Okay, I'll go on to the next. The next question is there anywhere we can find documentation on the design and architecture of the API itself? Not documents on the API functionality, but the thinking behind how the API is put together. David and Mark, would you say that that really is included in the API documentation that we have?
Yeah, I would. I would echo that it is in the documentation, and that it really builds off of the XBRL 2.1 specification. The API itself, right, is designed to conform with any database that's supporting XBRL instance documents that were created to the XBRL spec.
That's right. So like if you break down the API into, and actually David's going to go through this looking at the documentation in a few minutes, you can see all of the different sections of the API and how they connect to the technical spec. So hopefully that'll be helpful. The next question that we got is, do you provide any historical trace for deprecated concepts? Could we trace the lineage of a concept between taxonomies using the API? Mark, I don't know. Do you know if that's possible to identify if a concept has been deprecated using the API?
Let's see. No, actually, I'm not sure about that part. I know that we can do that within on a limited basis in the XBRL tools application, but not sure
Right.
with the API.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you know, well, that's something we can investigate that. And that was a question from Pete Cleary. Pete, we'll try to get back to you on that. See if we can come with another answer on that for you. One other question we got that I do want to cover before we go back to David for the demonstration is, it says, you mentioned the API is not suitable for commercial use yet. Actually, our database is not suitable for commercial work. So the database where the content is, it's a very strong database. We have not designed it to be used commercially. We've really designed it for more of a demonstration. But the APIs, yes, they can be used with any kind of commercial database. So yes, those are designed for commercial use, and we're going to be continually expanding on them. And they're open, they're freely available APIs, so anyone can use them on any commercial database.
And Michelle, just to add to that, when we say not designed for commercial use, I think what we're thinking is we are not we're not set up to provide multi-layer security. Granted, it's as filed data, right? It's the same as in Edgar, but we don't go for high levels of support with our hosting service provider that guarantees uptime. However, right, having said that, in a cloud and in a almost universally cloud-based environment, I don't think downtime is an issue any longer. Speed may be an issue, although I think for us, it's probably more a function of time of day and the number of people who may be using cycles to query the data. So commercial use, yeah, I guess what I would say is it's not commercially a viable option, but that's because it's really a shared data pool. It's not something that you get exclusive access to. so that you can use. But if you set the API up against your own database, right, then you have what you need.
And that's something just to build on that, David. If you are interested in creating a commercial application, with the API, we're happy to help you with that, and we're happy to help you build your own database, because you can replicate what we've done with our database. I mean, we're a 4-person shop here, and I'm not technical, so between a couple of people, this database is up, was created and is maintained, and it's something that is definitely doable, and we can help you get there. So, if that's something of interest, please let us know. There are different membership options where we can help you, build out your own database, getting an RSS feed from the SEC.
And
David,
just
go ahead.
Yep. One last thing to go back to the question about deprecated concepts. We don't do it for concepts, but we do it for fact values. There's something called restated filings. So you use a report.restated parameter. And there's the same is true with a fact. You can do a fact, a restated fact as well. So there are ways to get at fact values that have been restated. But as far as taxonomy concepts, like Michelle said, we'll take that away as a question to come back to you on. Having said that, and I say that because that's a great place to put a question, right, for this online discussion forum, right? And as long as you're signed in, you're able to go to the online discussion forum, load up your new topic, and we come back to you generally within a couple of days. We actually had somebody who commented on the use of a restated marker, just I guess within the last hour or so. Anyway, having said that, coming back to the initial XBRL spreadsheet template that Mark shared with you earlier, that main sheet and the config tabs, I'm going to walk you through the balance sheet compare that we initially exposed to a small group of beta testers earlier this year, took some feedback, came back with a refined version for the entire XBRL US membership. And then last month, I think added a couple of new formulas. This is my own copy of it, so it's going to be a little bit different. I have taken it away, haven't changed any of the presentation, and I would consider this the presentation portion of the template. The things that you see in green are variables that you can change in order to change the information that's presented in the spreadsheet. So if I change the tickers from Apple and Google and Microsoft to Ford and General Motors and Harley Davidson, and be sure to hit the enter key so it recognizes the CIK, I get fresh data for those 3 companies, right? Scrolling down, one of the things that we've really tried to do is to make the queries as transparent as possible so that you see what it is that the API is doing in order to pull back data, because it's one thing to bury all of that in a formula that gets put in the formula bar and kind of disappears. But for somebody who's just trying to grok what the API is and does, looking at the formula really wouldn't mean anything unless you understood a little bit about how to put those formulas together. But if you're somebody who's looking for an API that returns a specific set of data, you can almost read these things like sentences. And that's that plain language approach that I mentioned earlier. This is for 3 CIKs. I want to get a 10K, right? And then I want to pull back the name of the entity, the state where it's incorporated, the CIK value, right? The report accession. These are all comma delimited values. I know it probably doesn't look that way. And then the parameters themselves are period and dash. So it's whatever the object is, whatever the parameter is, and then if there's an extension to it, that's a dash, and then whatever that extension is. One of the other things to note here is the use of something called sort, right? And it obviously does just what it's supposed to do. It either sorts it in ascending or descending manner. There's a limit, right? On this line, the end of this line, there's a limit where you don't have to pull back all of the possible data. You can just limit the number, in this case, the number of returned records for this report object is limited to 3, right? At the end of the day, I get this little section that gives me all of the parameters, right, that I've asked for, spun up into a table, right, with a couple of pretty important details at the end. This DTS ID, discoverable taxonomy set or scheme ID, and report ID. These are almost like key values in the database because it allows me to go from information about the report itself to information about the facts that are contained in the report, right? Furthermore, and mine is broken and I apologize, I've been trying to figure out why it's broken. It just says bad request. I'll have to figure that out. The model, the template does work, right? But I use that DTS ID, right, to pull the concepts that are used in that discoverable taxonomy, right? And this should populate with all of the, now we can try to go to the formulas, all of the credit and debit balance types that are monetary, right? Giving me all of the concepts sorted in ascending order for that DTS ID and giving me a little bit of information about the namespace. Important because you want to be able to distinguish between elements that are part of US GAAP and elements that are extended, where a company has said, there's no existing element that's good for me. I need to extend for this part of my report. So that's a little bit about the concepts that come back. I said I had made some modifications to this template. And one of the things that Michelle had mentioned earlier on was that we've been using this database for years to help us develop checks for data quality. So I return each company's data values, right? And these data values match up here, right? The variables that are noted. And where they match, I plug in the number. And again, it's just a matter of understanding a little bit about how to work with spreadsheets, how to make that data move from one cell to the other, right? Or just repeat that data. And in cases where the data is not found, assets non-current, right? I then just throw up a little asterisk and say, hey, this wasn't in the filing as assets non-current. Doesn't mean it wasn't in the filing altogether. I just don't know it, as I don't know enough about the accounting to know what goes into assets non-current. So this is what that total would be because their total assets say it was this amount. A later implementation of the balance sheet done by Peter Goldberg, right? Let me see if I can quickly get back to it. Peter's template we posted a couple of weeks ago called Balance Sheet Compare SEC Filers does a great job of resolving a lot of these asterisks because it essentially adds a taxonomy map and searches for several different common elements that might be used to make up this assets non-current number. So I encourage you to check that out. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but just to let you know that we have community members who are working to build these things out. The thing I did want to say about data quality, and I apologize for kind of wandering, is that I put in a query on my own spreadsheet that looks at the assertion endpoint. It's that assertion endpoint where we're returning data quality issues. And because I'm looking at the report IDs, right, for those 3 companies that are up above, I can tell you that there were problems in these filings. There's a problem in the 204401. There's a problem in the 2055591, and there are problems in, well, maybe not. So these 2 filings, Ford and Harley-Davidson, might have some data quality issues that are worth considering before you sign off on anything that says that this is a great company financial statement that's squeaky clean in terms of the way they're telling their XBRL story. I think that's about all I was going to be able to cover relative to the balance sheet compare. The next one is Michelle's R&D example.
David, thanks very much.
Sure.
Yeah, I will go ahead and share my screen. And we're just showing, these are all just examples of how the API can be used. And we just thought that these would be helpful, and we're making these all available. This one has not yet been available. I just finalized it. And this is a real simple one, but I thought it would be helpful just to see a very simple application of the API. And if you think of like the Google Sheet that this sits in right now, think of that as your software application. Okay, you have a software application, and then the API is kind of behind it, serving up the data that you need for your application. That's really all that the API is supposed to do. And we think it works pretty well, and it is something that is available for you to use immediately. So the application that I wanted to look at was comparing R&D spend for a couple of years by industry. So here, what I did is this is looking at all of the companies within the pharmaceutical preparations industry, and it's pulling in this SIC code, and you can actually pick a different SIC code here. And then it pulls in for the year 2017 and 2016, and then it just does a year-to-year comparison. So it's pulling down all of the all the companies within that industry group, and then just dumping them into this sheet. So let's take a look at the worksheet that was used to prepare this. So this is similar to, in David's spreadsheet, he actually did it in the bottom part of it. I just did it in a separate sheet. So here's the sheet that pulls in this data. And in this cell here, B3, we see the actual API call. So this one API call brings in all of this data that you see from here, from column B over. And then I did a little calculation over here in column A so that I could manipulate it a little bit more easily in the RD compare, which is the report spreadsheet. So here, this is actually pulling in, it's pulling all of this data in. And I'm going to just explain how this whole API works in a PowerPoint. So here's what this API call really looks like. This is pulling in R&D expenditures 2017, 2016 for all companies within the pharmaceutical preparations SIC code. And so now the first part of this is really just, here's the API. It's calling that API. And the first thing it's doing is saying, okay, give me SIC code 2831. And I actually set that up so it could be changed, so you could swap out a different SIC code and pull in a different industry group if that's of interest. Okay, and I also said, I want to get the concepts R&D expense excluding acquired and process cost, and R&D expense software excluding acquired and process cost. Because one of the things that you'll find as you start working with the data is that there may be more than one concept that is needed to report a specific item. So some companies may use R&D expense, other companies may use R&D expense excluding acquired and process cost, And some companies may use the third term here. You'll find that with many elements, and it's important to get a good understanding of the US GAAP taxonomy or the IFRS taxonomy or the FDIC taxonomy, whatever you're working with, so that you know what those different elements may be. So I said, I want to get all of those, all of the data for those elements. And I don't want any dimensions. Okay, I only want total numbers. And dimensions, for those of you who understand the taxonomy a little bit, or XBRL, dimensions are basically saying, there might be a company that reports, R&D expenditures by business segment or by geography, just Western region R&D expenditures. I don't want that. I want to get all expenditures. So I don't want any dimensionally qualified data. I then said I want to get just annual data. I don't want quarterly data. Actually, I'm not sure if R&D needs to be reported quarterly. So, but I know I just want annual data. So I said period.fiscal-period equals Y for annual. I then said I want period.fiscal-Y equals 2017 and 2016. So I just want to get those 2 years. And in fact, what I've done in my spreadsheet is I've actually set it up so that I can pick different years, so that if I really wanted to get 2016 versus 2015, I could do that also. I then said, and I want fact ultimus equals 1. Now, ultimus is something that's used in the API that explains I want the latest. If ultimus equals 1, that means just give me the latest figure for that. Okay, because oftentimes in a in a filing, there are going to be more than one data point, maybe 2017, 16, 15. So you want to get the latest data that's available. And then I specify what fields I want to report back. I don't really want to get everything. I just want to get the entity CIK, the name of the entity. I want it sorted. Remember, David had mentioned the sorting, and this is an ascending order. I want the fact value. I want the reported value for R&D. I want the time period, the name of the concept, because I want to know, which companies are reporting, which particular elements. I want the filing date, and then I want, the period fiscal year in descending order, so that I have 2017 on top of 2016, because then I can use that in my report with the Google Sheet. And then I want to report other information. So basically capturing all of that, and you can see how easy it is to understand what this means, kind of once you get used to it, then that gives me back the data that I want. So let me just go back to the Google Sheet again. So here, that's pulling in all of this data. It's being funneled up in here, and then I can actually change either of these years. I can change this to a different SIC code, and let me pick one that actually has R&D expenditures. Okay, so now I'm asking it for services, commercial, physical, and biological research. And it's going to go back in and pull that. It may take a few minutes because it's a fair amount of data. But then here it is. So it's pulling in. So it has recalculated this page, brought in companies like Albany Molecular Research, and then it's just populated this page. So this is a fairly simple one. It's not as complicated as a balance sheet, but I think it's a good example, just showing you how this can all work. So let me come back up here. And now we're actually going to switch over and explain to you how you can do this yourself. So I'm going to turn it back over to David.
Michelle, there's a question in the queue for you. Do these items have to be in a particular order?
I was on mute there. They only have the section that has to be in a particular order is the field section, because in that section, and let me go back on page here. This section, starting with the fields right here, this is the order that they will appear in the spreadsheet, and that's where the ascending and descending factors in. It really depends how you want to pull it in. The order of the items really doesn't matter at all, except for how it's going to end up being reported to you. But then if from the way it's reported, you're going to extract those data points and put them into something else, then it doesn't really matter at all. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay. Oh, I think we have another question. Let's see. Is there a roadmap for development of additional features for this API or additional types of APIs? Actually, that's a very good question. XBRL International is actually taking this on as this is going to be the XBRL standard for APIs, and it really is already. And so there is a group, a working group that's being put together by XBRL International that is going to focus on expanding on the API and maintaining it and supporting it. And they will be developing a roadmap for ongoing work on this. So if that's something that you're interested in participating in, the XBRL International Working Group, please let us know. You do need to be a corporate member of XBRL US or XBRL International, but we are very interested in getting people who are interested in participating in that. So with that, let's see. We have one more question. Is there a way to go back from the data received through the API to the human readable SEC filing where the data comes from to quickly double check the data, for example? Let me think about that. And yep. David, I don't know if you have an answer to that one.
Yeah, absolutely, there is. On the report endpoint, we have a SEC URL, and that will take you back to the entry in Edgar. I don't know if that answers the question. So you do get to the document. You don't get to the specific data point. I'm assuming, and unfortunately it's just an assumption, I'm assuming that with inline, we'll be able to map to the specific fact level. Mark, maybe you have some insight on that. Or maybe you can correct my understanding of fact, because I know there's a fact ID for us in the database. I just don't know if it goes back to the SEC fact.
No, it currently doesn't. It currently doesn't. In the database, pretty much there was a new field that we did add that has that does include more information about where it is in the filing. Unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't really explain more than that.
Okay.
We'll look into that question too, and come back to you on that. So that was Edouard Remev.
These are great.
These are really good questions, and we'll also
the data community
right
discussion forum, because if you've got that question, I can guarantee you 30 other people that are going to look at this probably have a similar question or would at least benefit from knowing.
Right. So we will post the question and the answer in the community forum. So with that, why don't we go back to you, David? And you can
I share my screen just really quickly? Because there was a point I didn't touch on that I wanted to touch on. Thank you. Back in the main sheet that you looked at, or that we looked at earlier, we talked a bit about the queries that you could select. You'll notice that this query actually uses two of these endpoints, report and fact, right? And then looks for some very specific information based on a ticker, right? Tries to pull back information about a Nike report, right? So when it does that, it looks at the document type, it returns that information, but then it kind of nests the fact information. That's one of the limitations in the Google Sheet implementation. Those of you who are doing application development, you'll see a break for paging. Excuse me, I think it's paging, where that's where this is happening.
Or David has a little bronchitis. It's a little wintry over in Maryland, where he's living right now, where he's from.
Thanks, Michelle.
But he's coming back. He's down but not gone. So
yeah, I guess the last thing to talk about is the documentation. Michelle, you can take the screen back.
Okay, I will do that. Hang on, bear with me a second here.
So the documentation is a critical piece to understanding how the API is laid out and how it meshes with XBRL. We have 8 endpoints, and you can see those endpoints listed in the bulleted list on the left-hand side of this screen. Inside of the documentation, all 8 of those endpoints are defined, and in addition, there are tables for each of those endpoints that list out the different parameters that you'll be able to query against and return information for. I'm going to steal the screen back one more time, Michelle. I promise you it's the last time. I thought I was going to steal it back. Here we go. So when you look at the documentation, right, this is the right-hand side of the screenshot that Michelle just had up. I go to the factual objects. It explains a little bit about the different endpoints, other endpoints that I can query against to get this factual information, right? Talks a little bit about different examples that I can look for, how I can search against that endpoint. And then it gives me a table, of fact fields. These parameters or attributes are what you can use against the fact endpoint. So if I want to look for data that has a start and end date, I should be able to give it a period start and a period end date as part of my query in order to return that data. Some of the more common ones that you've seen here today, hopefully, have been period fiscal period, right? I can use 1Q, I can use 2Q, I can use 3Q cum, I can use Y for year, right? The period year, right? These are, again, pretty self-explanatory once you start drilling into them, looking at them, and working with them. Again, not a difficult API to understand from the perspective of reading these as sentences, trying to take the mystery out of standardized financial data. But against that fact query, you can return all of this great information, right? And then if you go to the other 7 endpoints that we've set up, right, you get tables for each of them. So if you know what company you're looking for information about, or what period of time you're looking for information about, or what taxonomy you're looking for information about, all of that information is in that database. It's just a matter of creating a query that will return that data for you. Right. Michelle, I guess that's about all I wanted to say about the documentation. It is pretty complete. Oh, the one last thing down at the very end, right, is a little bit about authentication and how you can get yourself set up, right, to use it either through a desktop application like Insomnia for testing queries, right, or your own application that you develop, or using our Google Sheets add-on, which frankly is probably a great on-ramp to at least understanding the API prior to coding up an application. Because the Google Sheet really is, like I said earlier, proof of concept that you'll be able to return data. It lets you spin things up, prototype things really rapidly. So if you're trying to push product along in your queue, right, better to say, hey, I can do this. Here's a Google Sheet that represents what the data would look like once it comes back, before you go to management or before you go further along the chain and say, you know, do you want me to put in the extra time that it takes for me to code this up in our language or in Python? And that's it, Michelle.
Great, David, thank you very much. Let me go back and share my screen. We just have one last slide and then we'll let everybody go. Okay. We just want to explain to you a little bit about, you know, how can you access the data and how much can you get? As I mentioned, you know, our database is really for demonstration purposes, and it is not really for commercial access. However, we do make it available to everyone. and anyone, member or non-member, can access XBRL US data. But only XBRL US members can join our open source, our data community. So that's something that we do. It can be as you can come in as at low a level as $55 as an individual member, or $250 is what we're calling a power user. But in order to access that community, we do need you to be a member, and this table kind of walks you through the different types of access. So organizational members of XBRL US, which can be corporate, academic, nonprofit, or startup, have desktop access to our database. They can use tools like pgadmin. You will need to get a grant of use agreement with us, but basically any organizational member can have complete and total access to the database. The XBRL API you can use, of course. You can get unlimited records. We have a limit on the returns per request of 2,000, just to kind of keep our database going. And you also can have access to the company filing analysis and taxonomy view and compare tools. So organizational members have the highest level of access. For individual members, what we call sole practitioners, which are individuals, typically accounting professionals who may have a single person practice, or what we call power users at $250. They have the same level of access as corporate members. So they have the desktop access, they can access the API and get 2,000 records returned per request and get unlimited number of records. They can also have a company filing, which was that online interface that Mark showed you a little bit earlier. For basic individuals, which is only $55 a year, they have a limit of 2,000 records on the API, and they can get 500 records returned per request. So it's a little bit lower level of database access there. They have unlimited access on company filing analysis and the taxonomy compare tools. And then for non-members, non-members also have access to the data. They can use the APIs, and they have a limit of 1,000 records, and they can get 100 records returned per request. So just different levels of access. We encourage everyone to become a member. At a minimum, become an individual member so that you can join the community and be able to have a higher level of data access. But we have membership because it helps fund the development of the APIs, the development of the database, the ongoing work that we do, and we really want to build our community. We really want to get the APIs used. So that is, I think, all that we wanted to cover today. We will be conducting other webinars as we have new developments in the API, and we encourage you to, come in and take a look at the API, play around with it, and create a spreadsheet with us. So we look forward to seeing you in our community, in our online forum, and we'll send an email out with more information about this in the next couple of days. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you on future XBRL webinars. Thank you.